This lecture is going to start, or this video is going to start, with a bit of a teachy element, but I think it's important that we understand the tools that we're working with so that we can use them more effectively. I know you'll follow along, and I know you'll do as you're told, and you'll copy the code that you get, but I think you'll get more out of it if you understand why we're doing what we choose to do. Now, WPF, Windows Presentation Foundation, is a technique of coding. It's a framework of coding that we're going to use, and it allows us to follow in with some sort of industry standards that you would hope to work with. We approach coding hopefully logically, and a logical approach to coding would be that we would follow what I would call an effective development approach. That's where we try to separate the things we are going to work with into different areas of concern, or different areas of looking at. And we talk about an interface layer, we talk about a logic layer, and we talk about a data layer. Now, you'll sometimes hear them called tiers: interface, logic, and data tier. And the three-tier approach is just one approach to coding systems of application development. So this is what we tend to work with. And I'm going to go through each one of those in relation to the project that we are working with. But to give you a general understanding of what they're about, have a look at this drawing for a second. The layers are represented in this way, but they're logical, they're not physical. There's nothing that you could knock your foot against or touch or anything like that. These exist as logical separations within the code that we create. It might be that within a solution in Visual Studio we have three projects. One is the interface project, one is the business project, and one is the data project. But I wanted just to understand what they're for. Now, the interface and presentation layer is the one that you're most familiar with, because that's what you use when you use a computer or a mobile device. And it's used for display and user interaction. That's for data input and data output. The business logic layer is there to process the data that we work with, and the data layer is for CRUD: create, read, update, and delete. And that's what we do with data. We do nothing else with data. And this particular architecture, or this system, says that if I want to process something from the interface or presentation layer and store it, I pass it through the business and logic layer to make sure that when it gets to the data layer, it's in the correct format, it's the right shape, it obeys the rules of the database, so that the database only gets troubled by things that it can handle, and that anything that it can't use is rejected before it gets it. And in the other direction, when I wish to return data, for example, when I open my mobile phone and I want to look at my my websites, I want to send from a database to the presentation layer, it's passed through the logic layer or the business layer so that when it gets to the interface, it's in the correct shape, it's in the right format, so that the interface and presentation layer can process it and give us the useful information that we want to use. So that's what the layers are for. And there are lots of different architecture systems that we tend to use. So let's just look at these in turn relating to our application. This is just one way. It's just one way. It's not the right way. It's not the wrong way. It's just one way. So for our data layer, for our application, we're using a simple text file. And we're going to read our ASCII code set in from a text file, as you know. And we use classes to access the data. It's to provide us with a connection into the text file. And then we use methods to return the items and lists, and quite often we return those items and lists as a data table, and sometimes as a stream of data going into a particular class that we want to use to handle it. In our logic layer, we have classes and methods that we need, and we just spent ages building those, and they're now all done, I hope, apart from one or two that I think I might have to add later. And we use these to do work for us. They do all of the things like manipulate the strings. Remember when we used that one to take some data in and create a username? That's manipulating a string to trim a string and then reverse a string. We can use these methods in the logic layer to do work for us, so that when it gets to the interface layer, it's in the right shape. And these are highly effective for extension. What that means is that if I think I've got a method or a class that we want to make more efficient or extend the features that it has, it's really easy using this method of separation of concerns, to just extend it. And then it doesn't affect anything else. It doesn't change anything else. It just gives us more features and facilities when we choose to use them. It's highly effective for maintenance. And imagine that if you've got something in the logic layer where you find that there's a better way of doing something, then you can improve it. Or you find that there's a different way of doing something. The rules for something have changed. It's really easy to change it, and it just is then bubbled up through everything that's using it, and it's done. So it's really, really good. And then there's the interface layer, and we're going to use the Windows Presentation Foundation, which is the focus of this particular lecture set that I'm trying to do, this slide set that I'm trying to cover in this video. It has its own interface layer file, and it has its own logic file. Now, the logic is implemented as C#, so nice and comfortable. We've just spent a lot of time in C# when we're creating the classes that we use for our logic layer, so you should be nice and comfortable with that. So let's think about the interface layer first. The controls that we use are defined using what's called markup. Now, you've got some experience with web development, so you should be able to help think about this as a system of tagging like HTML. And right at the end of this, I'm going to give you some code that's going to be some markup as applied in WPF. One of the great benefits of using this system is that instead of using an XY coordinate system, then the controls that we use are relative to each other, not absolutely fixed in position. And this gives us the benefit of being able to produce more responsive design, so that we don't end up with, when we've designed something to fit a particular size of interface, that when we change the size of interface, then there isn't a lot of free space where these controls are no longer situated, or not enough space when we make the interface smaller. So WPF markup is written in a particular language, and it's called Extensible Application Markup Language, XAML. Okay, so that's the name of the language that we will use. Now, ML, common at the end of it there for lots of markup language, and that's what it stands for, markup language, hypertext markup language, and so forth. So you'll see the ML used up for markup languages. I don't know whether you've ever considered markdown languages, but that's a bit of fun that we can maybe consider when we get a chance. So what happens with this markup language? It's the same as when you're using a browser. It's interpreted by the interface. We've got a tool at the end that you're looking at on your interface, and it interprets the controls, and they're constructed from components. These components might be a thing like a text box, a text block, a button, and our whole interface is constructed from these components, and these components are hosted or live in containers. Now, to help you to think about this, think about the div container in HTML5. We can separate divs to make sure that we can treat the areas of an interface differently, so that we can apply different rules to them. And that's what we do in a web browser page. So we got this already in our heads, I hope, that we separate into containers, and then we put things in those containers. And there's a whole new approach to development happening now, where everything is based on web components, and they're called web components. And the web components are built independently. You build it once and you can just copy it and use it anywhere you like. Where it works here, and imagine that you had a sign-in component that contacts a database, authenticates a user, and then allows them to get into the system. You build it once, and you can use it wherever you like. And we'll have much more on this later, because it's something that's a really interesting focus of discussion. Now, in common with HTML5 on web development, what you can do with WPF is you can apply what are called styles. And the benefits of styles should be clear to you from your experience with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. There's a central definition. You write it once and use it many times. If you think about CSS, that's the way in which that happens. You write the style once, and then whenever you use that particular type of control, for example, an H1 tag, then you apply the style automatically. Now, that enables you to test it centrally, coherently, and effectively. Test it once, it's always going to work because you're always just using the same thing. So that allows an application of standards. That could be an interface standard for clients to say that they always want something to be of a particular type or color or size or shape. And it also allows us to reuse it. Once we've made this decision to style something in a certain way, we know that when we reuse it, we just have to call the style. We don't have to rewrite the code. It also allows us to override it when it's required, because we want to make sure that we don't have something that's going to be completely unbreakable, and we can't make exceptions when we need them. So in application of styles, what we do is we apply them to the controls that we work with, and controls are properties. If you think about the background, the margin, the fonts and text boxes and so forth, these are properties of a control. And what we do is we apply the styles to these properties that we're going to work with. And we can apply them at container level, like the div, or in terms of WPF, a stack panel. And we can apply them at individual control level. We might say that we want the text within a text box to be a certain space away from the edge of the text box by applying padding. So WPF is highly relevant. So Microsoft is committed to it, and they continue to develop Visual Studio using it. It's been around for a long time, since the mid-80s, I think. And it's very, very robust. A lot of the things that it was experienced, I can remember using it right at the beginning, and it was a bit flaky, but it's not now. And it's even been ported into .NET Core. Now Microsoft is going towards .NET Core, and in fact the next version of .NET Framework will be the last version of .NET Framework. So they're committed to taking WPF forward. It's used in product development, as I say, inside Microsoft. Visual Studio was developed using WPF. And it's now also been committed into open source, so community development is being used, and that demonstrates real commitment to me. They're saying that, okay, we want your ideas and we'll integrate them as we need them, and why don't you have a look at this code and see what you can do with it, make sure that you can play with it. So one of the other great things about WPF is that it allows us to think in ways which are very, very useful in terms of other styles of development. For example, like the ways in which you develop for mobile using frameworks like React, Angular, Ionic and Vue, and maybe even Flutter to a little bit. But so it's very similar in terms of its processes of thinking to others, where you're using markup and then you're using code within the markup, although those frameworks are getting so sophisticated and clever that it's that WPF is kind of stuck in the desktop environment, where the others can be used for multiple tasks now. But it's a very similar thinking process. So that's WPF in a nutshell. And I'm sorry that was so long, but I didn't want to split the content up. So next what I'll do is I'll just show you a style set that you're going to need for our application development. So let's look at the use of these styles. So the styles go into the app.xaml file. The app.xaml file is like a central resource, like you would do with a CSS. You would put all of your styles in one place in a separate folder, but here we put them in a separate file. Now I'm just going to paste them in and just go through these. I'll just go through one, because the same thing that applies with one applies to all of them. So as I said, we apply styles to a control type, and here I'm setting up a style in this one here for a text block. Now, text block is something that just displays information like a label in Visual Basic or in Visual C# in a Forms application. And I'm calling this page header style. This will go at the top of the form to give it a certain style, and it means I can apply it whenever I need to make a new page. So we apply properties and values. So we say a setter is going to be a property called horizontal alignment, and the value is going to be center. The setter is going to be the font size, and the value is 36. And that means that, and so forth, as you go through all of these items that I'm setting the properties for, you can see I just call that name. Whenever I want to set this up so that it's consistent across the whole of the application, I just call that name, and it's a static resource. And I just say, it's available, I'm using it, I want to apply this style. So I just call it, and I'll show you how we call those styles in the next few videos when we use them.